begin by welcoming everybody. Of course, welcome to the panelists who have generously offered their time to join us and give some presentations and discussion today. And also to all of you who have joined this evening. This is the Salton Sea Air Quality Community Forum. It's been sponsored by the California Air Resources Board and UC Riverside Center for Health Disparities Research. And this is the fourth event in the series. You can always check the videos on the previous sessions, and we will also have a report. I'm David Lowe. I'm in the School of Medicine at University of California, Riverside, and director of the Center for Health Disparities Research. And so I welcome you all for joining this evening's session. I think this will be some very interesting discussions on a couple of different important questions to the community, how community is engaging with a lot of the important policy makers and stakeholders in the region. So let me move on next to Elizabeth Shealy, who is CARB's Research Division Chief, and pass it on to her to give her welcome.
Thank you, David. As David just said, I'm Elizabeth Shealy. I'm the Chief of the Research Division at CARB, and I really just want to welcome everybody to the final session of the Salton Sea webinar series. We've been really pleased to co-sponsor this series and appreciate also the financial support that we received from US EPA. I want to thank the Planning Committee and the team at UC Riverside and all the previous speakers for their work for making this event possible. We have appreciated the thoughtful presentations and all of the discussion. And I'm really looking forward to today's presentations as well. And these focus on what our research needs in the Salton Sea region, as well as how the public can engage decision makers on how to address these needs in the future. We hope this webinar series and the final report will promote continuing dialogue between researchers and community members to work together to develop collaborative research projects in the future. Once again, thank you and welcome to today's session.
Okay, as Elizabeth mentioned, we had a marvelous engagement in the entire process that was initiated by CARB with the Planning Committee, and we have some representation. And at the end of today's session, we will have a panel discussion with a number of people representing various aspects of the community, including the Planning Committee. And so that will be hopefully a very interesting discussion to help us, as Elizabeth said, identify important research needs, opportunities, and so on. So let me then pass on to the next stage here. Let's pass this on to Kelsey Bosch, who will provide our land acknowledgement, get us started.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Kelsey Bosch. I work for the 29 Palms Band of Mission Indians as our Cultural Resources Specialist in the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. I'm here today to present a land acknowledgement, but first I just want to say a big thank you to all that are involved in this important work. I'd like to share with you a Chemehueve traditional style of greeting. It's the phrase for "How are you?" Haga de yo. You guys want to repeat that at home? Haga de yo.
Haga de yo.
Haga de yo.
Today I am speaking from the reservation lands of the 29 Palms Band of Mission Indians, who are a Chemehueve people. These lands are located alongside the Whitewater River channel, which flows to the Salton Sea. From time immemorial, the Coachella Valley has been occupied by the Cahuilla peoples. And right now, I'd like to take a moment to give recognition to the modern tribes, which include Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla Indians, Augustine Band of Cahuilla Indians, Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, and the Torres Martinez Desert Cahuilla Indians. Our office, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, was created to protect the tribe's cultural and environmental resources and combined with the Environmental Protection Agency. From a tribal perspective, these are not separated. There's a relationship between the air, stars, the landscapes, the plants, the animals, and the cultural resources. The 29 Palms Band are of Chemehuevi ancestry and lived and traveled throughout the whole Mojave Desert, including the Coachella Valley, since time immemorial. There's misconceptions about tribes. One of them is that they lived in and they didn't manage their environments. But indigenous peoples have shaped the environment to interact with the landscapes in a sustainable way. From the Northern California tribes with fire management, from here to the desert tribes, how they manage the oases, the seeps, and the springs, which kept water flowing in remote parts of the desert, keeping the land and people in good health. Today, tribal governments and organizations keep this tradition going. So why do we do a land acknowledgement? Many times these are simple phrases to give acknowledgement, but we hope to move beyond that. Yes, to give recognition, but think about how long people have been living in the Salton Sea region and how we can continue that legacy. Thank you for letting me speak to you today.
Thank you, Kelsey. So I will now pass this on to Catherine Rodriguez, who is going to moderate our first part of our event tonight. And I will just hand it over there, Catherine. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I will be just introducing our amazing speakers for this evening. And just as a reminder, just like our past sessions, we're going to use the Q&A section for the last part of this event. We encourage you to take a moment to submit your questions throughout the presentations on the Q&A section at the bottom, or through the chat, and we will make sure to, address them at the end. And we will have a panel discussion too, so we have a lot to discuss this tonight. So I'm gonna start with the first presentation, which is from Daniel Polk from HARC. So welcome, Daniel.
All right, thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Muy buenas tardes a todos y gracias por acompañarnos. My name is Daniel Polk. I'm with a local nonprofit, HARC, Health Assessment and Research for Communities, and I'll present about the past, present, and future of the Salton Sea. Next slide, please. So the main point that I want to make this evening is that the problems facing the Salton Sea, the reason why the shoreline is receding, is not primarily due to drought. It's not primarily environmental constraints. It's a result of political decisions that have been made by individuals and institutions over the past 2 decades. And thus, that means that the solutions lie in engaging these political institutions and imagining futures that are more sustainable and more just. So I'll briefly go over a historical background, current water politics, and what might be politically possible in the region. Next slide, please. So as I'm sure most people are familiar, the Salton Sea appeared during a series of floods on the Colorado River from 1905 to 1907. It's important to note that during this time, white colonizers were in the process of settling the region. They were new to the area. And for these white colonizers, the flooding of the Salton Sea was completely unexpected. And when the sea appeared, they saw it as a waterscape that was unusual, strange, even mysterious. But we have to note, as we were reminded by the land acknowledgement, that this area has long been inhabited by other peoples. The Quetzan and Kukapa along the delta and banks of the river, the Kuya to the north, who set up fish traps and likely fished when the river would flood, and also the Kamiai Indians who would settle in the Imperial Valley whenever the channels would periodically flood with water. So the idea that the Salton Sea is an unnatural, strange, unusual place, I would say is a relic of a white colonial mindset. And I think that instead we should see the area as dynamic and ever-changing. The Salton Sea is part of a long natural process of a fluctuating river zone, flood zone. Next slide, please. So as we see, and I should say the graphs I have here are taken from a recent report by the UCR Salton Sea Task Force. It's an excellent resource if anyone is interested in further information. In this graph, we see the water level of the Salton Sea as it fluctuated in the early part of the 20th century. The water level shot up during the flood. When the flood stopped, the water level began to steeply decline, and then it started to become relatively stable starting in the 1920s. And why is that? That's because of the growth of agriculture, large-scale irrigated farmland in the Imperial Valley. It's important to note that with the rise of agriculture in the region, this explosion, this boom of farmland was made possible by the systemic exploitation of racialized farm labor, first Asian immigrant and later Mexican immigrant workers who were at times not only exploited, but also brutally repressed whenever they tried to organize in the 20s, 30s, and 1970s. That helps us make more sense of why to this day there are persistent racial inequities in health outcomes, as well as economic status. It's a legacy of this racialized system of farm labor. Next slide. Now we see the lake level, the water level, up until the contemporary period. It began to decline, as we see here, in the 2000s, the early 2000s. And why is that? That is because of the rise of a large rural to urban water transfer, the Imperial San Diego Water Transfer, which was signed in 2003. Basically, Imperial Valley farmers are conserving water, using less of it, less flows into the Salton Sea, and as a result, San Diego, and to a smaller extent, Los Angeles and the Coachella Valley have more water for urban growth, basically. Now, when this water transfer was signed in 2003, it was well understood what the environmental consequences would be. People knew that as the sea would shrink, habitat would be lost and the air quality would be imperiled. And so as a part of the water transfer, it was stipulated that the state of California would be responsible for the environmental mitigation. Next slide, please. And so that's why today we have the Salton Sea Management Program, funded and directed by the state of California. Here are a few details about the management program. They have a phase one, a number of projects they're in the process of constructing. Only a small percentage of the projects have yet been constructed, but there's plans for many more. And there's also a phase two long-term plan. The Salton Sea Management Program has a long-term planning committee as well as a community engagement committee. They have public meetings you can attend. They have documents you can read. There's many ways to get involved. And also critically, this is only one of a number of public offices that have a role to play in the Salton Sea. There's the Imperial Irrigation District. There's the water districts in LA and San Diego, Coachella Valley. There's Congress, the state legislature. There's the Department of Interior. There's a whole ecosystem of public agencies that you can look into and try to get involved in. Next slide, please. And so if we're thinking about engagement, maybe even advocacy, what is it that the Salton Sea needs? If you were to ask me, I would say it needs more funding, more research, and above all, more water. So far, the Salton Sea has received over $345 million in funding. That's a drop in the bucket. 10 years ago, the state did a study to see how much it would cost to fully restore the ecosystem. The price tag was $9 billion. So if you take, even if you did half of that, that preferred alternative, as it was called, there's still an enormous amount of funding that's needed for the Salton Sea. That can come from bond money or appropriations from the state budget or even federal funding. And of course, there's a need for more research, hydrology, research on the sediments, and above all, the health impacts. What are the sediments that are being exposed and what are the physiological impacts on people's health? We still yet do not know. And that's vital research that scholars at UC Riverside are in the process of investigating. And then of course, the Salton Sea needs more water, not less water. There's a long drought in the basin. There's the threat of the climate crisis, further decreasing supplies. There's a need to boldly state that the Salton Sea needs an augmentation of water, fresh water, through the existing canal systems that connect it with the river basin. More water makes it more likely that habitat can be sustained and that human health can be preserved. Next slide, please. I think it's important to step back and to reflect on how we conceive of the Salton Sea. What cultural meanings do we attach to the waterscape, to the landscape? There's kind of two main perspectives I like to think of. On the one hand, there's an urban perspective, dominant among folks in LA and San Diego, urban water managers, reflected in news reports. That's what we see in the lower left-hand corner, this perpetually broadcasted image of the dead tilapia on the shoreline. What does it represent? It's an image of the Salton Sea perpetually in decline as a place defined as unnatural and unsightly. But on the other hand, there's another perspective represented on the right. And that's a viewpoint that highlights the natural value of the Salton Sea as a vital habitat, its role in protecting air quality and human health, and also the idea that it's not a place of decline, but of potential growth. The promise, in this case, of lithium production, geothermal energy production. It's a perspective that is important in advocating for the sea. But regardless of which viewpoint one adopts or engages with, I think it's important to keep in mind the moral argument for the Salton Sea. Whether you see it as a place of decline or potential growth, there's a moral imperative to invest in the sea, to ensure that the human health of children and adults in the region are protected. And that requires more funding, more research, and more water. Next slide, please. And then finally, here's another image of the lake levels, the water levels. These are three possible futures. If the sea continues on its current course, if it receives no further water inputs, no augmentation, it will continue to decline. And we can imagine that will involve the loss of habitat and the further deterioration of the region's air quality. But if further water sources are secured, the water levels could be stabilized, or even we could have a recovery to the historical water levels of the 20th century. Whichever possible future is realized, it will depend not only on the actions and decisions of policymakers, but of the public, of community members who have a vital role to play in advocating for the sea. Next slide. And with that, I'll conclude. If you have any questions, you can always send me an email, even give us a call. We're a community research organization, and we're happy to help anyone find data or answer any questions. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was an excellent presentation, and I think it was a great way to start this this session. And a great transition too for our next presentation with Elizabeth Romero, which focuses on how to engage with agencies and legislators. So, and just before we start, just a reminder, this is the time to submit your questions during the Q&A, and we'll answer them at the second hour.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Daniel, for setting the stage for this presentation. My name is Elizabeth Romero, and I serve as Assistant Vice Chancellor of Governmental and Community Relations at UC Riverside. But I'm also a lifelong Eastern Coachella Valley resident. I grew up in Thermal, and my family is still in Thermal and in Mecca and throughout the Eastern Coachella Valley. And so this issue of the Salton Sea, its restoration and its potential future is not only important as a regional issue, but it's very personal to me and my family. And so I thank you all for participating, being part of this process, and especially thank you to CARB for partnering with UC Riverside to have these important dialogues. Today, I'll be speaking to the importance of advocacy and how you may engage. Many of you on this call, I peruse the participant list, are expert advocates, but I also think it's a great refresher in terms of what we could be doing collectively to raise the voices of the community in this process. So next slide, please. So advocacy is a word that we use often, But really at the core of its approach and why it's so important, it's the ability to lead system level change in public policy. And so advocacy takes shape in many different ways, and I'll be speaking to some of that further down in the presentation. But what's really important to note is that advocacy is really how we can move from an area of interest and concern to action. Next slide, please. And so in terms of advocacy, there are different levels of engagement that residents and people in our community can have. The first two areas, the observing and following, really is about creating a level of awareness, understanding that there's a problem. And that can be something as simple as opening or doing a search on a website about a particular issue, agreeing to receive or following something on social media, or signing up for a newsletter to just know what's going on. When we move up in the pyramid of engagement, there are different actions that you could be taking to become more engaged on a particular issue. That includes endorsing, so signing petitions, making small donations, sharing content with others. And then you move up to contributing, which is really more of a multi-step level of awareness. You join a group, you start attending events like many of you have today, and you start getting into the area of making more intentional contributions to a particular issue. And the higher levels of engagement and those that are oftentimes much more focused include ongoing actions. So being part of a collaborative, joining a group, making more of an investment of time, of money, of your own social capital to participate. And leading is really the highest level, which includes engaging others, becoming the person that's on the front end of having meetings with elected officials. And so it's really important that, knowing that you can engage at different levels throughout the cycle, but understanding, how much you want to commit to a particular issue is something that's really important to do on the front end of engagement. Next slide. There are several types of advocacy, which includes public awareness campaigns, education. Oftentimes it's, many nonprofits or organizations really spend time in the public awareness and education side of advocacy because of limitations through their nonprofit status. But there's a great deal of work that can be done on public awareness and education campaigns that doesn't involve, direct lobbying. Direct lobbying is not just paid lobbyists, which is what we typically associate, but it's actually going as representatives, as issue experts to talk to elected officials and policymakers on particular issues. Grassroots advocacy and organizing is much more community-led and involved. And next slide, please. That really focuses on our citizen-based advocacy. We have to remember that all politics is local, and the general public is really at the forefront of being able to make significant contributions, even more powerful than lobbyists. It's very important, especially for the legislature, for Congress, to have a strong community support. And so that really demonstrates the local value, the impact, exposure, and engagement of various stakeholders in these processes. Next slide, please. So why does grassroots advocacy matter? Well, it's the duty of elected officials and state agency heads, nonprofit organizational leads to listen to their constituents, to be able to thoughtfully address their concerns. There are also powerful motivators in having a strong grassroots or community engaged approach, which includes clearly re-election and having voters support the various policy initiatives that they are pursuing. But there's a level of recognition and influence that comes from having a strong foundation of residents that participate with you and for you. Effective grassroots advocacy also can, as I mentioned, yield even more influence than powerful corporations. I want to, point to examples that we've seen in recent years. If you think about the tragedies that have happened through, gun violence, for example, and the uprising that young people had around gun violence reform, that is a powerful grassroots movement that stemmed, unfortunately, from tragedy, but has really solidified the important voices in that issue that have included young people and mothers and others that are concerned about the prevalence of guns in our communities. So that's an example of strong advocacy at the local level that has also translated to strong advocacy at the federal level. Next slide, please. There are various tactics that can be employed to be effective advocates. That includes your legislative campaigns, which involve looking at policy, proposed bills, engaging in letter writing or email campaigns, and making sure that you count social media now as part of a strategy to contact elected officials is actually much more prevalent, but it never really takes as much as a actual hard letter going into elected official offices. I hear that very often. There's also media lobbying. So ensuring that you have strong radio, TV, newspaper campaigns. People are writing letters to the editor. And we've seen, obviously, throughout time, a lot of mass movements that have led to social uprisings and campaigns that have included protests, boycotts, walkouts, and marches. As a matter of fact, if you follow much of our farm worker movement, there's a march that is taking place now from the Central Valley to Sacramento that's incredibly powerful and also speaks to the power of grassroots advocacy. Farm workers and everyday people taking stock of what's important and actually mobilizing themselves to have a public demonstration. That's very powerful and draws attention from the media, but also from policymakers who have to pay attention to these mass movements that are happening in our backyards. Next slide, please. But I'll say that, as somebody who works in advocacy every day, there's nothing like establishing a strong foundation and a strong relationship with elected officials, policymakers, and their staff. It's very important to get to know first who your legislator and who your representatives are at the local, state, and federal level. But it's also very key to get to know their staff. Oftentimes their staff are the frontline participants in policy dialogues. They're often the ones that are policy experts in the office and tend to have a significant influence on the legislator. And so, I always remind our advocates when we take advocates from UCR to Sacramento or DC, from the moment you walk in the door, the receptionist, the Capitol Fellow, those people are very important because one, they're taking note of how you walk in, how you treat the staff. Kindness goes a long way. And also, they're the ones who tend to be the receptacles of information. So it's important for you to also do your homework. And while, for those of us that are not scientists, no one is expecting you to be a policy expert entirely. But there are a lot of good resources. Daniel, for example, offered to be a support on data. There are researchers, there are different people that will provide you with the information or publish the information that can help make your case. But what's really important is to know what you feel about this issue. Why is it important to you? And speaking from a personal place is very powerful while knowing the issue. And so it's important to, dedicate some time to understand why you're advocating for or against a policy, not just taking it for its face value, but what's really in the language and how does that affect you and your family and your community. Find out who is also in the same position as you and establish a coalition. Having a unified position or approach is very powerful. Many of the agencies that are participating today, the representatives that are participating on this call today, have built coalitions. And so those are very powerful when you can see 20, 30, 50 organizational names and have those also be joined by residents. That's incredibly powerful when you are specifically advocating for a position. It's also important to know who your opposition is. Who are you going to go up against? If there's a specific proposal, who are the people who are potentially to benefit from it? That's really important so that either you can start having conversations with those or at least understand what arguments they'll be making against your position. And sometimes you may need to negotiate. And negotiation is not a negative word. It's better to compromise oftentimes than to lose your bill in its entirety, in my humble opinion, and make incremental change. And the other piece of this is gratitude. It's really important to demonstrate gratitude to the elected officials, the staff, the folks that are supportive, and sometimes who are not supportive, but have at least taken the time to listen to you. A couple of tips for when you do go in to have a meeting or advocate directly. Again, know what your ask is. Are you asking a legislator to fund a particular project? Are you looking to have them vote yes or no for a particular area? And also remember that they're people too. And so oftentimes, especially in this day and age, we're seeing a lot of negative discourse towards elected officials. And no one goes into these spaces or into these roles to get yelled at or be treated negatively. So common courtesy, as I mentioned, goes a long way. I've talked about doing the research, ensuring that they know that you're a constituent. So mentioning that up front is very important, and make it easy for them. No one is expecting you to have all the answers, but if you have materials that you can leave behind, that's very helpful. And additionally, follow up and express your gratitude for those that have taken a meeting with you. And specifically, as we've talked a lot about the, next slide, please. The California budget process is such an important area that impacts the Salton Sea specifically. I wanted to just focus in, next slide, please, to mention that the California budget process is really where we express our values. So as we see this process going through, it's really a cyclical budget process. And so as we've talked about significant investments being needed for the Salton Sea, I want to remind folks that just because a budget is signed doesn't mean that that process ends. There's a lot of different steps that I could spend, a couple of hours going through. And I do want to also lend my email, my contact information, so that if folks have specific questions, I'm happy to also answer them directly. But public input is just such a key part of this budget process that our governor and others have so many priorities, from homelessness, public safety, expanding access to healthcare, that sometimes things like the Salton Sea could get buried in a pile of other priorities. So ongoing engagement is so important, especially when it comes to the Salton Sea. And with that, I'll just end and say thank you again, muchísimas gracias, to everyone who's participated in making these forums happen. And I thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for such an important and powerful presentation. This was a great overview of the steps we can take to get engaged with legislators, and it just makes me think about all the different ways that we can all work together. And on that same note, we're going to continue with Chris Moran from Heart 2, and he's going to be talking a little bit more about the importance of the community needs assessment. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for having me. As you said, my name is Chris Morin. I'm a senior research associate at HARC, and I'm just going to be talking about needs assessments today and an overview of what that process entails. Next slide, please. Okay, so I don't think I'm going to go into too much detail on who HARC is. Daniel, my colleague, I think he already covered that. So I'm just going to give you an overview of what a needs assessment are. Or what a needs assessment is. I'll give you a foundation, a toolkit for conducting a needs assessment. It's a very good step-by-step program. And then if we have time, I'll go into a few examples. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is a needs assessment? The Centers for Disease Control definition is the first bullet right here, and that is the process of identifying key health needs through systematic, comprehensive data collection and analysis. So it's quite a mouthful, right? But all a needs assessment really is trying to do is to identify the existing health problems, the existing issues and needs that are in the community. We're trying to understand what the perceptions of these issues are by community members, by local organizations, by leadership. We're trying to also understand what community members recommend and what local organizations and leadership recommend regarding these health issues that we have identified. So that's a needs assessment in a nutshell. There are so many different ways that you can accomplish or carry out this type of project, very many different ways. I have a link here that you can visit. The slides will be made available, and this link includes some published models that you could follow step by step. Like I said, there are very many different ways to do this. You don't have to follow it entirely, but that's just one resource for you. Next slide, please. So this is the toolkit that I want to go over. This is a great foundational approach to conducting a needs assessment. Now, the blue rectangles you see here, these are the steps that comprise a traditional needs assessment, and these are the steps I'm going to talk about. The dark square, that's just when we report the results, and then the green squares are all about the implementation. That's where we are trying to figure out solutions to the problems that we have identified. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, I'm just going to talk about the needs assessment portion of this toolkit, these 5 squares here. The first step is to reflect and strategize. So we say we want to conduct a needs assessment. We need to understand if there's any previous work. Elizabeth mentioned earlier in her presentation that doing homework is very, very important. And that's where this step comes in. You're going to be doing a lot of homework right here. You want to find out if previous organizations, previous entities have conducted a similar project, a similar needs assessment on this topic. And that's invaluable because we can understand any problems that they might have encountered along the way, any recommendations that they would give. Maybe they found some health problems and we can expand on those, or we can just further explore what those problems might have been. Another bullet in this first one for the reflection stage is to develop a unified vision. This is very important at the beginning. I see it often. You want to make sure that all your team members have a unified vision. It's okay for a needs assessment to have a couple different topics, right? We often want to investigate different things under a large umbrella of concepts, but we want to make sure that all our team members have the same vision, right? We're all coming from the same place because we don't want the project to be too disorganized. So from that, we move on to the second step, which is to identify and engage stakeholders. And in this step, we're forming an advisory council. This is a team of local organizations, local people that kind of have a foothold in the community. These are experts within the topic that we are investigating. So we at HARC, we specialize in research, right? And data analysis and measurement tools and sampling techniques, stuff like that. But the advisory council comprises people that work in this field, in this topic, whatever it is we're investigating. They work in this day in, day out. Because of that, they know the folks, they know all the specialized knowledge that comes along with it. And so they're going to be invaluable, and we should involve them in every step of the needs assessment. They can help us develop measurement tools, fine-tune our questions. They might know cultural sensitivities that we wouldn't know about. So it's very useful to have them on the team. So we move forward into number 3, and that's to define the community. So we say we want to do a needs assessment, and now we have a team. We need to figure out what the geography is. Let's say we're doing a needs assessment on the Salton Sea, right? And say it's pulmonary health around the Salton Sea and air quality. Well, we got to actually define it a little bit further. What is the Salton Sea geography, right? Is this just the immediate communities and folks around the sea, or is it all the way out to Indio? So we have to define what that geography is. We also want to know the population. Is it people, just the general population around the Salton Sea? Or are we talking about kids, working age adults, seniors? So we want to have these questions ready before we move into this data collection phase. And that's number 4. That's kind of the part that a lot of people think of when they hear needs assessments. This is where we're going to be collecting and analyzing data. Now I have 2 bullets here, secondary data and primary data. You don't have to do both of these, but the secondary data part is very important because we're working with data that already exists. It's publicly available data. So it might be from a research firm, it might be a government entity, whatever the case is, it's data that already exists. And because of that, we can use it to paint a profile of the community. We can kind of tell a basic story before we jump into building our own tools, our own surveys and interviews and focus groups and so forth. So just kind of going back to that Salton Sea example, let's say we did want to do a needs assessment around that. We could pull secondary data. We could say, here's how many people live in these communities, right? Here's how many kids. Here's the expected population. Here's the current air quality. This is all data that publicly exists, and we could use that to paint a picture of the Salton Sea. But the secondary data is not going to answer all the questions that we have. We still won't know the lived experience of these folks. We don't know any, say, underlying health conditions. We don't know their perceptions of these problems that we have spoken about, right? And so that's kind of where the primary data phase would come in. We might develop surveys, key informant interviews, focus groups, whatever it is we need to answer these questions that we're interested in. So after that, we've collected a lot of data, right? We move on to step number 5, which is the prioritization phase. And here, we're just going to prioritize the health needs that we've uncovered. There are a multitude of ways that you can do this. You can simply rank order it. There are plenty of models. I'm actually going to show you a model that I really like. It's good practice to ask the community what they think about these problems. What do they perceive? How do they think we could solve some of these things? That'll come in handy, especially at the implementation phase, which was all the green squares that I showed earlier. We could also ask the advisory council, local organizations, and so forth, what they think about these problems and how we can solve them. Next slide, please. So this is a prioritization matrix. This is just one way that you can prioritize problems that you've uncovered in a needs assessment. I really like this, and I think it's important to think about before you collect data. So before you design those survey tools, right? Before you do the focus groups and so forth, because this can help you answer a lot of important questions very well when you design your tools. So the first square we have is magnitude. So how many people are being affected regarding this problem? We can answer that. We might be able to answer that with our secondary data. Severity, so what are the health consequences of this topic we looked at? Is there an increase in, say, emergency room visits for asthma or something, or additional underlying health conditions that we uncovered as part of our needs assessment? Disparities is very important. So are there certain groups that are being impacted more than others, right? So we need to ask people about their demographics, their class, socioeconomic status, and so forth, so we can know if there are vulnerable populations being impacted. And then the last one is feasibility. So there might be problems that we uncovered and it's possible that the organization can't address them, right? We still want to report it because it's something that other organizations could certainly work towards, but it may be something that we're not able to adequately address. Next slide, please. Okay, and I think I'm out of time, so I'm just going to skip the examples. I just wanted to talk about how different needs assessments can be. The first one is just everything I've talked about so far, and the second one was just a little bit of a different project, but to respect time, I'm just going to go ahead and end here.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much for being so good about the time, and for taking us step by step through such an important process. Grateful to know that the Coachella Valley has access to that important tool. And I will be adding your website in the chat just to make sure people can find HARC easily. So I think the next presentation is going to tie really closely all the other presentations. Tonight we have Patricia Carrillo from Alianza, one of the local leaders in the Coachella Valley. And I feel like she's going to be able to kind of like connect all of the past presentations in one. So thank you for being with us tonight, Patricia.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you so much, everyone who's with us this evening. It's such a pleasure to be here with everyone. And we're really thankful as Alianza for the opportunity to share about our collective work, really focusing in on engagement through a collective impact approach, which is really at the forefront of everything that we do. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Awesome. So since 2010, we as Alianza Coachella Valley, formerly known as Building Healthy Communities Coachella Valley, we have successfully engaged residents in addressing some of the most critical issues impacting the Coachella Valley. And so Alianza, which stands for Alliance in Spanish, is a union of people and organizations working together for a common goal. And so Alianza is the only alliance in the Coachella Valley bringing together community members, nonprofits, and government to lead efforts we need for a thriving region. And so our mission is to transform the socioeconomic conditions of the Coachella Valley so that all people in the community can be able to prosper. And we really aim to attain big system shifts that will improve the community's socioeconomic and physical health for generations. And so we do this through our collective impact initiative and approach, which is organized around 3 strategic priorities. So we have our environmental justice campaign that focuses on the Salton Sea, infrastructure, air quality, water quality. And we have our community justice campaign that focuses in on education equity, really making sure that students have the resources that they need to be able to be successful. And our community justice campaign focuses really heavily on the implementation of restorative practices and budget advocacy. And we also have the third component, which is youth leadership, that focuses in on really building the leadership of our youth so that they can not only be the change makers for the future, but also for the present. And they're really heavily involved in the work that we do. And that includes components of civic engagement, such as Get Out the Vote, GOTV. And in response to the pandemic, we've also added on to our work the COVID-19 response efforts. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And as we look at Alianza and what we stand for as an organization of a union of people, we recognize and we're really proud to say that we don't do this alone. And it's important to highlight that we don't do this work alone. And it's really about bringing in partners with areas of expertise so that we're stronger together. And so anytime we as an organization, we say Alianza, Alianza is all of us being able to come together and really be able to get to the root cause to see that change that we want to see in our community. And so this is a few of the partners that we work with for the full scope of work that we do around environmental justice, community justice work, and youth development work that includes Coachella Valley Parents, Loma Linda University, KDI, the Center, Líderes Campesinas, Sierra Club, YLI, RU Health, as well as many consultants and supporters and professors that we've worked on with in the past, for example, and in the future, which includes Dr. Chris Benner, Dr. Manuel Pastor, Dr. Will Porter, Dr. Ryan Sinclair, and many others. And the team composition really reflects various expertise that's needed to achieve our goals to make sure that it's a resident lived experience, strategy and management, and content expertise. So if we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And so we really focus on 4 components, which is to shape, elevate, advocate, and lead. And so really shaping the systems to remove barriers to economic and physical health, elevating local resident leadership through opportunities for civic engagement, advocating through resident-led issue-based campaigns that really foster new leaders and collective impact, and leading through strategy for comprehensive policy solutions for our region. And if we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And so the central question that we ask ourselves as an organization and as a collaborative is, what does it take to transform the socioeconomic conditions of the most marginalized to achieve optimal economic and physical health? And so based on that question, the central question that we ask ourselves, our framework is really to achieve empowerment through self-sufficiency. And that includes recognizing the importance of a strong safety net and its limitations, identifying the underlying causes of poverty, and addressing them through strategic changes. And the third component, which would be engaging impacted communities in the solution and increase capacity for members of the impacted communities so that they can be stakeholders in the decision-making process and making sure that they have a seat at the table in every space. If we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And so here on this slide, you are able to see our methodology, which really focuses in on the things that I mentioned prior, which is really assuring that we foster the leadership of the community so that we're able to listen and engage with the community and then be able to assemble a team that will then focus in on the root cause analysis to be able to determine the shared goals, which then leads us to be able to create a strategy to focus on system issues that we want to focus in to be able to then have the wins that we want to see, which is community-driven policy change. And we also acknowledge that throughout the process, there might be moments where we might need to adapt and reflect to be able to continue on with the process. And how can we assure that throughout the whole process, there's engagement with community members, with leaders, with professors, with experts who are all at the seat at the table to be able to see the change that we want to see. So making sure that there's alignment with on-the-ground efforts, as well as how we partner with elected officials who are championing in this work as well. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And so some of the early achievements that we've been able to have as a collaborative and as a community, for example, have been achieving new parks, paved roads, covered bus stops, and increasing public transportation investments in marginalized rural neighborhoods. And when it comes to representational government agencies, we have changed the water district from an at-large to representational seats that led to the first Latino member of the board and representation of Eastern Coachella Valley needs and initiatives. And if we can go to the next slide. And so additional achievements and wins that we've been able to see as a collaborative, together we have been able to expand infrastructure for undeserved areas in the Eastern Coachella Valley. Through our community justice campaign work, we have been able to transform school discipline policies to include restorative justice and restorative justice practices, and being able to remove school resource officers within Coachella Valley Unified School District. And then when it comes to our youth development work, we have been able to build upon leaders in civic engagement and include them in all the various campaigns. And through this work, the youth have been able to create inclusive spaces such as ECV Pride, the Hue Music and Arts Festival, and KERMS. And also our most recent win has been CVUSD board approval of wellness centers for middle schools and high schools. And when we look at some additional wins specifically focused on environmental justice work, we have advocated successfully to have the ECV community such as Thermal and Oasis be part of the CalEnviro Screen 2.0. That's now included in every version updated by the state. And so really we're just focusing in on making sure that there's collaborative work throughout the process, making sure that the community and folks are all representative and included in the table when it comes to funding decisions, when it comes to implementation decisions, and all decisions that are taking place. And as we continue with the work, we're excited for the continuous work that is taking place, for example, with our resiliency community meetings where folks are able to address any questions, any concerns that they have, as well as being able to provide the opportunity for them to be able to be provided with trainings. And so in closing, if we can go to the next slide. I just want to thank everyone for your time today, as well as provide you with our contact information. My email address is there, as well as our environmental justice campaign leads, Aide and Adonis. And we're really thankful for the partnership, the leaders and community members who have really continued to move this work forward in the past and currently.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you for all the work that you and Alianza do for the community, and with the community, I should say. And so we're gonna continue with tonight's session, and I hope that all the presenters are able to stay for the rest of today's session. Tonight's session is gonna be a little bit different than our past 3 events, just because we're gonna have some special guests as part of our panel discussion. And Dr. Lowe is going to be leading that discussion. We have some questions, but please, you are still encouraged to submit your questions through the Q&A. We will be disabling the language interpretation feature so that we can all be in the same room. So for presenters, know that I will be translating for you. So it's gonna be a little bit slower because we're gonna have to be going English, Spanish, English, Spanish. But that's just to make sure that we are all able to participate in the same conversation. So I'm gonna pass it on to Dr. Lowe. And again, this is the time for participants to submit your questions in the Q&A section.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. So the intention for this session is partly to place a bookend on the whole series, where we've heard a lot from previous sessions on what research has been done in the region, and on the idea that we know a little bit about what's going on and what the concerns are. And then today was, how do we bring some of these concerns to agencies, government officials, and so on, but also how do we continue to identify the priority research areas where we simply need to know more information. So maybe I should let Catherine, do you want to, should I pause here and let you go, or?
Yeah, no, I haven't disabled the translation. I just wanted for you to introduce everyone, and then.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. That's great. Okay, so I'll continue. All right. So as I said, given the series, then we can assume that we don't yet know everything that needs to be known. And despite that fact that there have been a lot of people doing important research in the region, there are a lot of areas that we might want to cover that are of relevance and importance in the question of what else do we need to know. That includes air quality, the environment and ecology, water science, as well as more direct issues such as healthcare access. So are we continuing to gather the relevant information? And that includes, as we saw in the first session, on the questions arising from proposed lithium extraction programs. So we invited some panelists to help get that discussion going. And I thought this was really important to have the particular group we have here because of their ongoing engagement in the community, as well as the ongoing research they've been doing. So I may ask our panelists to introduce themselves, but I wanted to highlight that Ryan Sinclair at Loma Linda has done a lot of work. And he was, of course, mentioned in the presentation from Alianza in the communities around the Eastern Coachella Valley. Michael Cohen is so important. The Pacific Institute has done such an incredible job of collecting lots of information and producing reports that have really placed an important context for all of the issues surrounding the Salton Sea. And I think I can't think of a better assembly of really relevant framing of the issues that have been coming up, and with the deep research that the Institute has been doing. So it's really valuable that we were able to get him to join us so that we can have a discussion on, what else do we need to know, and how do we identify those new things that we need to know. Sahar is a researcher in the Salton Sea region, and she's also going to provide us with some additional community perspectives as well. But maybe I will hand it off to them and maybe give better introductions than I could. So maybe I'll just let Ryan get started and just tell us a brief thing about yourselves.
Okay, hi everybody. Yeah, Ryan Sinclair. I'm faculty in the Loma Linda University School of Public Health. And when I first came here about 10 years ago, I went out to the ECV to kind of get involved with the water issues out there, water and sanitation, and found myself kind of drawn to the issues around the Salton Sea and see the link between health and the Salton Sea. Anyway, I'm currently working on some projects with Alianza, and I'm using a community science approach, and we've built up a network of community members where we go out on a boat and measure nutrients and also bacteria and some other water quality parameters. I've worked on a couple of other things in the past in the ECV, including a health survey and in 2014, and a couple of air quality programs as well. But yeah, I'm trained as an environmental microbiologist, but I find myself working on a lot of different environmental health topics in the ECV. So I'm happy to be here and happy to talk about how to get, how to get the right priority and right mix of research to be done to address community needs and concerns, and ultimately build out a better place to live, with the development mindset.
Mm-hmm. Michael?
Thanks. I'm Michael Cohen. I'm a senior associate with the Pacific Institute. The Institute's a nonprofit with about 30 people now, based in Oakland, although we have people all over the world. I'm actually based near the headwaters of the Colorado River, and I've been working on the Salton Sea. I've produced, put out 3 or so reports on the Salton Sea over the years, and have been active really on the policy and working with the state of California to encourage them to start expediting the implementation of projects at the Salton Sea, and continuing to be, I guess, a thorn in their sides. So very happy to be a part of this, and thanks for including me. And I will drop the Pacific Institute website address where our reports are all available at no charge.
Great. Sahar?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sahar Forzan. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Anthropology at UCR. I'm a PhD student, and I've been there 4 years. And I'm also a graduate student researcher with the Center for Health Disparities in the Community Engagement and Dissemination Corps. My dissertation work focuses on environmental anthropology with the intersection of medical anthropology and health disparities. What I kind of look at is how, when we're thinking about the Salton Sea and environmental pollution as a settler colonial problem, as a racial problem, how well does restoration address this? How does it fit into this question? And when we're looking at environmental politics, what forms of life are enabled or constrained in those situations? So that's kind of a little bit about what I do. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a big hard data person, but I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Sahar. So I have some questions to sort of prime the pump on the discussions. And as I said, the overall focus of the sessions has been on health impacts and environmental exposures. But it is obviously a complex issue where it's tied to a lot of different factors. And that's why I wanted to raise the broader questions and sort of see how you all and our panel react to this. So one place I'll start, and we've heard this about advocacy, engagement. Often I hear from communities is that they don't feel seen or heard by a lot of the people who affect policies or implement plans and initiatives. And so the question is going to be, for the communities and organizations, what kind of information still needs to be gathered that can help shape new or ongoing policies? And then how will the residents know who can be trusted to do this work and who can be trusted to deliver that information? So it's a little bit of a two-parter. So maybe go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, just want to make sure. I'm gonna disable the translation piece now, just to make sure that we can all be on the same place. Ok, perfecto. Entonces, el doctor Lo nos comenta que los foros comunitarios de ahora han sido organizados con un enfoque principal en los impactos de la laguna del Saltón Sea, en la salud de la comunidad. Parece que hay una frustración de las comunidades que sienten que muchas veces las agencias, los legisladores o los sistemas de salud no los escuchan. Entonces, parte de la cuestión es poder llevar esa información a los legisladores que quizás no estén al tanto de lo que está pasando realmente en la comunidad. Entonces, la primera pregunta es ¿qué tipo de información se necesita recopilar que podría ser muy importante para poder crear nuevas políticas nuevas? ¿Y cómo pueden saber los residentes en quién se debe confiar para hacer este trabajo? ¿Y cómo sabrán quién es confiable para entregarle esa información?
So I guess we can go in order. I guess Ryan and then Michael and Sahar.
Well, you know, as far as interacting with communities and helping people to feel like they're a part of the process, it's probably the biggest and most important question about community engagement. I would say that to know if the information should be trusted, you should look at the method that was kind of outlined by some previous speakers, where you really need to use a robust community engagement approach where people are listened to. And so basically there needs to be a response from the agencies that it reflects that they've actually heard people and actually have a forum for them to actually say something and talk. So, and to actually rephrase that, I would say there needs to be more than this unidirectional or one direction. We're relaying information to you. It needs to be two-way discussion. And so that's one way to know if you should trust the information, just to see if they're responding to what your concerns are in the first place. That's like a base level that you should start from.
Is there information that we still need to find out, though? I mean, are we doing the research that needs to be done? What's missing?
Oh, well, you know, there's so much uncertainty with so many topics at the Salton Sea. So when responding and involving people in any kind of program or any kind of mitigation project, you know, it's really about listening to them to define what, or to have them help you define what the problems are, and then addressing those things through a systematic approach. And by asking questions, you generate new questions, and it's kind of the scientific process that way. I guess I would say that every time I go into the Salton Sea with a question, I end up with a bunch of more questions, and that's a really good thing to wind up with. However, the Salton Sea also has negative impacts on people's health. So if it gets us closer to the end point of actually improving lives, then that's a great thing. So we do have to be a little bit cautious. Personalities like me, especially, where I just get so involved in the weeds, that I look to the community actually for guidance on what's important and what's relevant.
Okay, great, thank you. So, la pregunta primero fue que cómo podemos confiar en una agencia, de dónde podemos agarrar información confiable. Entonces el doctor Sinclair contesta que pueden guiarse las personas en el tipo de organización con la que están trabajando. O sea, tienes que asegurarte que esa organización realmente tome el tiempo de escuchar a la comunidad, que esté realmente interesada en trabajar con la comunidad y que tenga un método o sea, de conectarse con la comunidad y de escuchar cuáles son sus pensamientos y abrir espacios para que esas personas puedan venir a comunicarse con las agencias. Entonces, si esas organizaciones están haciendo todo ese trabajo, entonces puedes confiar en ellas. No solamente es de ellos te están dando información, sino que tú estás trabajando con las agencias para poder resolver los problemas juntos. Entonces, y el doctor Lo le preguntaba que si estaban haciendo, si la investigación estaba siendo suficiente, si en realidad si estaban investigando las cosas correctas. Y el doctor Sinclair le contestó que aún hay mucha información que se necesita, él siempre que va a trabajar con la comunidad, siempre se enfoca en tratar de escuchar lo que la comunidad le dice. Si la comunidad le dice que falta información, que falta investigación en ciertos temas, especialmente en el Saltón Sea, porque se trata de temas que afectan la salud, pues siempre es importante escuchar lo que la comunidad tiene que decir y saber cómo pueden guiarse y trabajar juntos para conseguir las respuestas a sus preguntas y para poder crear un sistema para poder conseguir toda esa información.
So Michael, I have to admit, I've read the Pacific Institute reports cover to cover, and you get this sense that they're so incredibly comprehensive, yet there's still more, right? So how do you answer that question? What other things still need to be researched?
Well, thanks for reading the reports. It's always nice to know they don't just sit on shelves, so I appreciate that. I thought Chris's needs assessment, the prioritization matrix, provided a good frame for looking at what kind of questions could be posed and could be researched. So which impacts are felt across the greatest populations? Which are the most severe impacts? What are the sources of those? How are those felt disproportionately among different communities? And then maybe we can get to feasibility that's more of a policy question. But those first three really, I think, could help guide research. So taking that a step further, to me, there was some interesting research that came out of our Salton Sea Summit several months ago. And then to take that the next step would be, how are these aerosols or these particulates felt in different communities around the Salton Sea? Are they at a magnitude that actually affects public health? And then maybe the next step, and this might be a little bit different than direct research, but what are some of the remedies for those? What kind of interventions would be appropriate? And then we can start moving into the feasibility question, what's cost effective? So to me, and really coming at it from a policy lens these days, is where can we best apply limited public funding to address these public health disparities, particularly those that are caused by the Salton Sea, but many of those are also caused by outside factors. So trying to get a sense of what's the best way to do that. Are direct methods for suppressing dust at the Salton Sea Playa, is that the best method? Is installing air filters at schools or public health facilities or in people's homes, is that more effective? So trying to get a sense to me as to how we can respond to these new threats and where these threats are coming from and how they're felt by or received by the different populations. To me, those are all outstanding questions that need to be addressed as the state starts making decisions on how it spends its money.
Catherine.
Ok, el doctor le comentaba a Michael que él leyó el reporte del Instituto del Pacífico donde hablaban sobre toda la investigación que está pasando, que se han estado haciendo en el Salton Sea, pero que todavía existían algunas preguntas y le preguntaba qué otras cosas se tienen que investigar. Entonces Michael le contestó que primero, gracias por leer el reporte, es siempre bueno saber que la gente está leyendo esta información. Él piensa que utilizar la presentación que dio Chris Morin, donde explicaba las medidas para poder entender cuáles son las necesidades de la comunidad y para poder priorizar cuáles son las cosas que realmente necesitan atención de estas agencias, es la primera cosa que podemos utilizar para poder saber qué falta, qué investigación falta, qué información falta. por ejemplo, él piensa que una de las cosas que debemos identificar es cuáles son los primeros recursos no recursos, cuáles son los primeros causas de la contaminación, de dónde está proveniendo, cómo están afectando a las comunidades. Entonces, él siempre se pregunta, se guía por dos cosas. ¿Qué es lo que qué es lo que más se necesita? Y también, cuáles son las cosas que sí se pueden hacer, que sí se pueden llevar a cabo de acuerdo a los costos, cuáles son los métodos más efectivos. Siempre son cosas que ellos tienen que considerar cuando están haciendo una investigación. El próximo paso que ellos consideran es, por ejemplo, estudiar los aerosoles, cómo las partículas afectan o llegan a las diferentes comunidades y en qué magnitud afectan a la salud pública. Entonces, son muchos pasos que se tienen que tomar para poder llevar a cabo la investigación, y también tienen que pensar en cuáles son los posibles remedios y qué tipo de intervenciones son apropiadas para poder trabajar con la comunidad. Siempre es importante considerar todas esas cosas para poder hacer la investigación de manera efectiva y para poder dirigirla a las diferentes poblaciones que están afectadas por estos riesgos a la salud.
So let me follow up really briefly, Michael. Would it be fair to characterize your answer as saying we have the research to find out more about what's really out there, as well as the research that sounds more like, is engineering going to be the answer? Or is that's the wrong way to put it?
I'm not sure what engineering, I mean, there's all sorts of engineering solutions, but I guess really it's a policy question as to, is it more effective to treat the dust at the source or at the locations where people are experiencing the harm? And then I guess a second question, really even I think specifically on some of the research you've been doing, is how uniformly distributed are the emissions, particularly these new or the newly identified bacterial or biological factors that seem to be affecting public or affecting health as well. Is that a uniform distribution, or are those concentrated? And if they're concentrated, then perhaps addressing those directly at the source would be more effective. But to my mind, that's something we need to know. And if it's just sea spray, that's pretty uniform, and that's really not a feasible solution. So addressing it that where people are receiving those might be more cost effective.
All right, good, thanks. Go ahead, Catherine.
Okay, thank you. So la pregunta era si la ingeniería es la respuesta o esa es una manera incorrecta de ver las cosas. Michael contesta que la ingeniería no cree que esa no va a ser la respuesta o la solución. Él piensa que es más como una pregunta sobre la política y las leyes. En encontrar la mejor manera o la manera más efectiva de tratar los problemas en el polvo, de dónde proviene el polvo, o si enfocarse más en los daños que las personas están experimentando en sus casas, o entender mejor qué es lo que está pasando realmente. Entonces, él piensa que la pregunta es enfocarse, por ejemplo, ¿dónde están las emisiones de polvo tóxico? O particularmente como cuáles son las bacterias que están en el polvo, cuáles son los factores biológicos que están afectando a la salud pública, y entender mejor cómo se está distribuyendo esta contaminación para poder atender el problema de manera más efectiva. Entonces, tenemos que considerar todos esos diferentes factores al crear nueva investigación.
Ryan, did you raise your hand?
Oh, yes, I wanted to just raise something about the what Michael just talked about regarding the source or the vulnerable population. You know, where would you place the monitors? And that's a question that's pretty challenging for the Salton Sea, in that the risk is cost ultimately, because if you go out and place a monitor for something like a bacterial a microbe of some kind, and you don't find it at the receptor, at the sensitive receptor site, then you lost a lot of money that you you could have devoted towards going to the source to measure it, but then you don't know for sure that the source is going to transport to the community. So I've run into the receptor monitoring question several times in the last few years, and where you have negative results or no results or whatever. And so it's something that we need to discuss some more of and really customize.
That's why we're having this discussion. Exactly. Catherine.
Ok, sí. El doctor Sinclair comenta que es una pregunta muy importante la que el doctor Michael está mencionando, porque muchas veces es muy difícil saber realmente con los filtros qué tanto es el daño que se está haciendo si consideras como qué está ocasionando las bacterias y si en realidad está llegando hacia las personas o si está si el filtro lo detectó, pero en realidad no se esparció más lejos de los lugares donde están las personas. Entonces, sí, tiene que tener una discusión más, más enfocada en dónde podemos instalar estos monitores para poder encontrar la información correcta que nos ayude a disminuir estos efectos en la salud.
So, Sahar, do communities feel they have the knowledge or background to be able to say we need research on X, Y, or Z?
Well, I don't feel totally like the person to speak for community. I'm not from the community, but I think that communities have said what they wanted, what they want when they have the chance to speak, and they are speaking from their own experiences. And so I think that, those experiences are in and of themselves lived research, and that should be listened to and heard. And it's okay if it's not in the format that we typically do research, because those are things that people are experiencing every day. And you know what's happening to you when it's happening to you. So I think that definitely communities, like they when they're speaking about what they want to have done, and I think the Salton Sea Summit, the community forum, in the presentations by local nonprofits and communities, that they were doing that, and they were saying some of the things from environmental justice, economic development, to what they want to happen for their community. And to your first question too, I'd say of like what research needs to be done, I think there has been a lot of research done from the last 50 years or more, and I think that not that I would ever dismiss new research being done, but I think it's important for us to gather all of that information and put that picture together with the history of the Salton Sea and what's happened there. And I think that would help us to answer a lot of questions that, rather than reproducing the wheel in some cases, I think that would help to find out what research has been done and maybe even answer some questions that aren't necessarily at the forefront. I'd like to see, I think that like the military aspect of the Salton Sea has not been super addressed, like the Salton Sea's history with the military, and like the military is a big polluter and has been, and so like what has that kind of impact had in the Salton Sea? And I know there's research already done on that that's out there that could be I don't know, furthered, not by me, because I don't research on chemicals and things like that, but I think that those are important questions that tie into the questions of like pesticides and things like that. What else has been in there, as well as like what's upstream from Colorado River and things. And then I'd also like to see research that addresses how we do things as like the status quo when it comes to like physicians or policy and like things like that address community concerns when a community member goes to a doctor about an environmental health concern. Those aren't necessarily things that are trained, that physicians are trained for always. And so like what are the ways that we can support that those environmental health concerns and like accumulative health concerns aren't kind of said to be something that they're not, or kind of dismissed because the physician isn't trained to handle that kind of information. And I think that happens a lot. Even here in Riverside, if I go to my doctor and ask something, they're not prepared for all the environmental, air quality, pollution issues that impact us every day.
Okay, Catherine.
So the question is, la pregunta para Sahar era que si las comunidades sienten que ellos tienen el conocimiento o la facilidad de poder decir qué investigación se necesita en la comunidad. Entonces Sahar comenta que ella no es de la comunidad directamente, pero ella piensa que la comunidad realmente sabe qué es lo que necesitan y ellos saben qué decir cuando se les pregunta qué es lo que necesitan. Entonces, porque ellos han vivido y experimentado de manera propia qué es lo que está pasando en la comunidad y cómo afecta su salud. Entonces, cuando ellos hablan, necesitamos escucharlos. Incluso aunque no sea de la manera que nosotros pensamos como académicos, no sea el formato que estamos acostumbrados, pero esas experiencias de la gente en la comunidad son muy importantes. Entonces, ya ha habido foros comunitarios, presentaciones de las organizaciones no lucrativas en la comunidad, ya se ha hecho muchas discusiones sobre lo que necesita la comunidad. Entonces, necesitamos trabajar juntos, necesitamos colectar toda esta investigación que se ha hecho a través de los años y poder crear una imagen concreta y colectiva de todo lo que estaba pasando en el Salton Sea y entender qué es lo que pudiera ayudarnos a contestar las preguntas que aún necesitan respuesta. Por ejemplo, una de mis dudas siempre ha sido como cuál es la historia de la fuerza militar como un contaminante en el Salton Sea. Entonces, sé que hay investigación sobre ese tema, pero nunca he visto como más información al respecto sobre cómo impacta los niveles de pesticidas y cómo funcionan ellos como un factor más sobre la contaminación. Entonces, necesitamos trabajar juntos para tratar de eliminar ese espacio y poder no solamente colectar toda esa información, pero también utilizarlo para poder entrenar a los doctores, a todas las personas que están trabajando en la comunidad y que tienen la oportunidad de aliviar todas esas enfermedades que son causadas por la contaminación, que son causadas por el medio ambiente, y poder entrenarlos de una manera que sepan cómo reaccionar cuando estos miembros de la comunidad vayan con estas preocupaciones y que ellos sepan cómo actuar, que sepan cómo responderles a los miembros de la comunidad, porque a veces ni siquiera saben sobre los problemas de la contaminación del aire o problemas que están afectando a estas comunidades al día.
Thank you. I was going to maybe combine some of the comments between the three of you and ask a follow-up, and then we can go to some questions from the audience. So Sahar was talking about addressing things at the clinic. Michael was talking about whether engineering solutions in terms of filtration at schools or in homes, or finding out where the dust is worse and things like that. So I hear from a lot of different places this notion that let's fix the Salton Sea, let's find the solution, but I don't have a consistent answer of what that means. And so I know I'm getting into a real potential problem here, but maybe I'll go one by one. It says, is there any consensus, or should there be a consensus on whether there's going to be a solution? Maybe, Ryan?
So a solution for the Salton Sea, or a solution on what contaminant to focus on? Is that what you're asking?
Well, finding the contaminant, we already mentioned that, but then what is our answer? How do we fix the problem? So I'll leave it to you to decide which question you want to answer.
Okay, so I I'm working with Alianza fairly often, and I like their approach of trying to think about development around the Salton Sea and development of the future communities there. And so, there are several challenges and contaminants around the Salton Sea, but I feel as if we do need to focus on what is the Salton Sea now, as far as what is flowing into it. So I really like the concepts of looking for nutrients and say pesticides or other contaminants flowing in the Whitewater River, all of the agricultural canals and the New River and the Alamo River, and really understanding what is flowing into it and trying to really get a good model of how all those things interact with each other. And then on top of that, the other research comes out to talk about the aerosol models and the sea spray, the aeolian impacts, but focusing on the future to sort of build out the community. And so a really good solution to the Salton Sea problems would be to focus on the communities and community developments, things like constructed wetlands to manage some of this runoff, to manage some of that water that's going into the Salton Sea. I know there's a few different water plans out there, future long-term plans that use the available source of water that's flowing from agriculture and manage it properly. And those can be turned into recreational amenities. This is kind of a use what we have already and turn it into a resource topic, rather than try to correct try to build a big infrastructure fix on it. I think it needs to be approached in several different types of projects, but overall use the water that's there.
Okay, Catherine.
Ok, voy a tener que empezar desde la pregunta que hizo el doctor Log. Él pregunta que si él escuchaba cómo Sahar hablaba sobre que tenemos que pensar en las clínicas, en entrenar a los médicos. Michael hablaba de el tipo de ingeniería que debemos utilizar para poder entender qué partículas son más dañinas. Entonces, escuchamos que hay muchas discusiones sobre diferentes maneras de mirar el problema, pero la pregunta es, ¿hay una solución? O sea, ¿cuál es la solución que debemos de enfocarnos? ¿En qué solución nos debemos de enfocar? ¿En qué hay un consenso en lo que debemos de hacer, en lo que debemos de trabajar? Entonces, el doctor Sinclair dice que le preguntaba que si una solución para el Salton Sea o una solución para saber qué contaminante debemos de enfocar todos nuestros esfuerzos en. Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿cómo arreglamos este problema? Y el doctor Sinclair nos comenta que él está trabajando con Alianza de manera muy cercana. Él está enfocándose mucho en el desarrollo de las comunidades en el Salton Sea y su futuro. Hay muchos problemas en el Salton Sea, pero necesitamos enfocarnos en lo que está pasando en el Salton Sea ahorita y tenemos que enfocarnos en qué nutrientes, qué pesticidas, qué contaminantes están corriendo por el río, qué cosas tenemos que enfocarnos ahora para poder entender, o sea, lo que está pasando en este momento y para así poder crear un modelo donde podamos trabajar en todos los problemas que ya están existiendo en la región y poder interactuar en conjunto. Entonces, hay muchas diferentes investigaciones, como ya se mencionó, hay investigaciones sobre los aerosoles, sobre los diferentes modelos que se pueden utilizar, sobre el traer agua al Salton Sea, pero yo pienso que si todos esos esfuerzos y toda esa investigación se enfoca en crear comunidades y crear un buen futuro para estas comunidades en esta región, eso nos podría ayudar a guiar nuestras soluciones enfocados en el desarrollo de la comunidad. Y el manejo del agua hacia el Salton Sea, todo eso, todos los planes a futuro de las plantas de agua, de las plantas industriales, todo eso tiene que estar enfocado o tomando en cuenta el desarrollo de las comunidades a futuro. Entonces, no es realmente tomar una solución, crear una solución de infraestructura de la nada, sino tomar todo lo que ya está existiendo y tratar de enfocarnos en el futuro.
So Michael, maybe let's see if I can get you guys into a fight, but is there a consensus that there is going to be a solution out there? Is there going to be a let's use what we have answer?
I wish I could say definitively, yes, that's going to be the answer, but as you can see in the chat and some of the Q&A, and from, there was I think something in the Desert Sun recently talking about augmentation plans. And I think we heard a little bit from Dan, the need for, and frankly, the use of the you need additional water. So there's definitely a difference of opinion. And as we heard, I think from Elizabeth earlier, that's a hindrance for actually getting state and federal support, because until there's a unified position, the legislators are not going to throw additional money at a problem where there's no clear voice to say, here's what we want. I regularly argue that the legislature, the state legislature has said that there are 9 different priorities or clear objectives that the state has said should be achieved at the Salton Sea, including protecting fish and wildlife, protecting public health, improving water quality, minimizing dust emissions, and the like. And then I would also put that in the context of water in the West. So yesterday was a major day on the Colorado River. There was a ton of news articles, media reports about the 23rd year of drought and how that's crippling the Colorado River, which supports water or supplies water for 40 million people. 40 million people. So we're talking 650,000 people around the Salton Sea, but this is a water source for 40 million people. So the idea that there's going to be somehow additional water available to go to the Salton Sea when Arizona next year is going to lose close to 600,000 acre feet of water. The country of Mexico is going to lose 100,000 acre feet of water because that water simply no longer exists, largely due to climate change. So I guess I agree here with Ryan that we need to work with the art of what's actually possible. And that simply means less water. It's still a staggering amount of water that's flowing into the Salton Sea, currently on the order of 1 or 1.1 million acre feet. That's going to drop, could be to 700,000 acre feet or even lower, but that's a lot of water. And optimizing the use of that water, spreading it around, is something that could be achieved. And I think the sooner that people can rally around that and say, this is something we need to do it now to ensure that dust is not continuing to blow into the lungs of our children, but also providing habitat for birds that historically use the Salton Sea and really have no other place to go now because we've dried up so many of the wetlands and in the presence of pretty catastrophic drought throughout California and the West, that we need to move forward quickly on that.
Mm-hmm. Catherine?
Okay, voy a tratar de traducir todo lo que se ha dicho porque hubo muchos números que no pude capturar, pero como recordatorio para todos vamos a volver a grabar la parte en español para asegurarnos de que toda la traducción sea correcta. Entonces, la pregunta, el doctor Lo comenzó diciendo que quería comenzar una pelea porque parecía que no había un acuerdo en cuáles son las cosas, cuál es la solución real. Entonces, el doctor Lo le preguntaba a Michael que si él estaba de acuerdo de que se tiene que utilizar los recursos que existen y tratar de trabajar con lo que se tiene en este momento, con los recursos que se tienen en este momento. Y él dijo que pues realmente es muy difícil tener una respuesta porque es evidente que hay una diferencia en las opiniones y como escuchamos anteriormente en las presentaciones, en la presentación de Elizabeth, cuando se trata de involucrar a los legisladores, siempre tiene que haber una unión y cuando no hay una unión es muy difícil pedirle a los legisladores que inviertan dinero en un problema que no tiene una voz clara sobre cuál es la solución que se debe tomar, sobre en qué tipo de inversiones se tienen que hacer para poder llegar a una solución. Entonces, realmente ese es un conflicto y considerando el estado de California cuando se trata de la sequía que estamos sufriendo en el río de Colorado, es muy importante pues considerar que estamos hablando de agua, que es un recurso pues muy limitado en nuestro estado. Entonces, nosotros tenemos el Salton Sea que provee muchísima agua y le da un ecosistema a los animales de la región. Entonces, se tiene que considerar eso, pero también tenemos que buscar soluciones y trabajar juntos para poder, en realidad, enfocarnos en prevenir que siga haciendo un daño a la salud de los niños, a la salud de las personas en la región, pero también tratar de proteger el agua y tratar de trabajar con lo que tenemos en este momento para poder utilizar estos recursos.
So Sahar, you heard the discussion so far. What do we tell communities thinking there is an answer out there or a solution?
Well, I'd say it's complex and that there's not just one answer, but that I would say too that communities also would know what they would want to see the Salton Sea look like as well, and that should be taken into account in, as like Dr. Sinclair was saying, is like how people are wanting to see what their communities are like. And when it comes to like, there's a really great book, The Settler Sea. It's about the Salton Sea by Tracy Boyle. Is that she talks about Torres Martinez, and they had a drawing. I don't think it was a competition, but a drawing like presentation workshop or something where people submitted what they would like to see the Salton Sea to look like. And it was in the Desert Sun and probably other articles and news articles and stuff. But what it was a beautiful, thriving Salton Sea. And I think that idea shouldn't be abandoned and should be included. And I think to not abandon that idea would be to do what, kind of do what Dr. Cohen is saying too, and looking at Arizona and Mexico and the QSA or things like that. Like, what are we doing elsewhere that also needs to change when it comes to water policy? Those are difficult conversations to have, but I think like with climate change and with the history of the Salton Sea, that those are conversations that are necessary and that we should be having together, and looking at policy and our behavior when it comes to water, and not treating water as waste, but as treating water, not to say like we flush our toilets with water. We like do all these things with water, that water is valuable. We put it in crops and then we ship it out of the country. Like, what are we doing with our water that we better serve people that need the water to, prevent health problems and to live, and animals, and to make a thriving environment? And I think there's this idea of like control versus care. And I think right now the way we do things is trying to control the environment instead of caring for it. And so how can we shift our politics and our sciences to do that? That is a complex, nuanced answer to figure out how to do that. But I think that those kind of questions and that way of thinking needs to enter the conversation at the policy level as well as at the everyday level.
Okay.
Okay.
Catherine?
Sí, bueno, la pregunta es del doctor Lo, era, ¿qué le podemos decir a la comunidad que piensa que hay una respuesta para este problema? Entonces, Sahar comenta que es muy complejo porque tenemos que considerar lo que la gente quiere ver en su comunidad. Eso es lo más importante, porque ellos son los que saben realmente qué es lo que quieren ver. Ella nos comenta que hay un libro que se llama El colonizador del mar por Tracy Boyle, y ella hizo un proyecto en Torres Martínez donde hicieron una presentación o un taller de dibujos donde las personas compartieron su visión sobre el Salton Sea, qué era lo que querían ver en el Salton Sea en el futuro. Y realmente todos se enfocaban en un Salton Sea hermoso, donde había un ambiente precioso, y eso es lo que la gente quiere ver un cambio y que sea un cambio positivo. Entonces, para eso tenemos que analizar la historia del Saltón Sea, tener estas conversaciones que son muy difíciles y hablar sobre lo que necesita pasar para poder crear una política efectiva que analice también nuestras acciones cuando se trata del agua y el por qué no tratamos el agua de la manera que se debe de hacer y la tratamos y la desperdiciamos. Entonces, hay muchas cosas que hacemos con el agua, la utilizamos para nuestros campos y la utilizamos en el día a día. Entonces es muy importante, es un recurso muy, muy importante y tenemos que pensar qué son las cosas que hacemos con el agua. No la tratamos de la manera correcta. Entonces hay que entender el valor del agua y hay que entender cómo podemos ayudar a seguir manteniendo este recurso para las personas que necesitan el agua y a la misma vez prevenir problemas de salud y también proteger a los animales y a las personas que están viviendo en esta región. Entonces, pues tenemos que pensar cómo podemos cambiar nuestra manera de ver la política y la manera en que hacemos la ciencia. Sé que es muy complejo, pero pues estas son las cosas que yo pienso que se tienen que considerar. Entonces, hay que seguir teniendo estas conversaciones para poder encontrar una solución colectiva.
Okay, so I see there are a number of questions and some answers here. I'd like to prioritize the ones that have to do with the issue of what new research needs to be done. What are the new questions that we need to prioritize? So are there any people in attendance who had questions for the speakers in the first part of the session? I'm not sure I can see it from where I am here. Okay. All right. So I saw, go ahead.
No, I was just asking if you couldn't see the Q&A piece or
I can see the Q&A, but I didn't know whether there are other questions. I don't see any in the chat that are specific to, as I said, the general theme here, which is what new research needs to be done. What do we need to prioritize in new research in the region? I don't know if people had some questions about that. Okay. I did see a few interesting ones in the Q&A. Ryan did answer to one, which is, let me see. So John Armstrong asks, he believes that the major source of health hazards are the agricultural pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers coming from the New River at the southwest end. Ryan had started answering this question. I don't know, Ryan, did you want to go into a little bit more detail?
Oh, yeah. I really liked your question, John, because it brings up one of these topics that's kind of something that I really love when people are involved with it, which is nutrients and all of the excess nutrients that have been flowing into the Salton Sea for decades and decades. And I think that's one of these core issues that we need to address, fertilizers, that is. So, the same fertilizers that helps a date palm grow will also help bacteria or an algae grow in the Salton Sea. And those kind of ecological offsets will then also produce potentially aerosols in an unbalanced system. So that's a really important thing that we need to look at, that in combination with what is going on now in the last 5 years. I just took a look at a lot of the emergent wetlands around the Salton Sea. And I counted on Google Earth. I don't know if this is accurate, but 23 agricultural drains in the north part of the Salton Sea coming in, and 25 agricultural drains in the south part of the Salton Sea draining in addition to in the north, the Whitewater River and the Alamo and the New River in the south, which is a much greater flow than the Whitewater. But, you know, all of that stuff coming in, that represents resources, it represents contaminants. We really need to get a handle on that. And we really need to have, the state needs to have and support a dashboard that monitors those flows and those contaminants. I think that the Great Salt Lake has something like this. They have a dashboard where you can see more precisely what is actually flowing in to this Great Salt Lake, and we need to have something like that at the Salton Sea. We also need to understand the nutrients there and how this, you know, primary production happens, and the bacterial and algal blooms happen, and then initiate maybe some of this aerosol irritant that happens in the nearby communities. That and so many other things. The pesticides is even another topic. But, you know, ultimately, we need to understand what resource it is that we have and how it's flowing in. These emergent wetlands are really interesting. If you get a chance to look at Google Earth, just the last 5 years, a lot of them have just sprung up like crazy in the playa land. And we need to understand that, and can we use that and guide it? So.
Catherine.
Ok. Bueno, una de las preguntas que se mencionó fue la pregunta de John Armstrong, donde nos comenta que la principal fuente de peligros para la salud pueden ser los pesticidas, los herbicidas y los fertilizantes agrícolas que provienen del estuario del Río Nuevo en el extremo suroeste de la laguna del Salton Sea. La pregunta de John era, ¿por qué toda su investigación médica evita el tema del estuario del New River y el extremo sureste en general? Entonces, doctor Sinclair le contesta que a él le gustó mucho su pregunta porque es realmente un tema que se debe de analizar más y que debemos de poner mucha atención a los nutrientes que están llegando al Salton Sea y que han llegado por las últimas décadas. Entonces, es uno de los mayores temas que se tienen que estudiar y que tenemos que entender mejor, cómo los fertilizantes que pueden ayudar a una palma de dátil a crecer, también pueden ayudar a la bacteria y a las algas a crecer en la sal del Salton Sea. Entonces, tenemos que mirar a todos los efectos ecológicos que tienen estos contaminantes, los fertilizantes y todo lo que se utiliza para la producción. Porque también, además de producir, pues las plantas también pueden producir los aerosoles que son dañinos para crear y que crean un sistema que no tiene un balance y que puede generar aún más problemas. Entonces, el Estado realmente necesita apoyar la creación de monitores o sistemas donde se puedan monitorear estos contaminantes, y necesitamos entender qué tienen los nutrientes y qué rol tienen en la producción de bacterias. Entonces, puedo hablar por mucho tiempo sobre los pesticidas porque es un tema en sí que es muy grande y muy extenso. Pero finalmente la idea es que nos tenemos que enfocar en los recursos que tenemos y entender qué es lo que está pasando de una manera más detallada. Y les invito a que miren lo que está pasando, por ejemplo, usando la aplicación de Google Earth, para que puedan mirar todas los diferentes brotes que han estado ocurriendo en los alrededores del Salton Sea, para que puedan entender todo lo que está pasando en esta región en los últimos 5 años.
We are really toward the end of our session here. I'm gonna take a risk, and I noticed that Kay Wolf asked a question about Pacific seawater importation, and I saw that Michael had answered it, and I think Daniel had answered. Do either of you want to jump into that one about Pacific Ocean water importation?
Unless Daniel wants to jump in.
Sure, I'll just mention briefly, I thought it was quite helpful how David framed the discussion. So I hear Michael and Ryan saying that we need to work with the resources that we have, the projects that have been proposed, the water resources that we have. And of course, there's a politics to this of how people discuss this publicly. On the one hand, there's what I see as very bold and outlandish proposals to import seawater, which to me seem almost impossible. And on the other hand, I imagine there might be more practical ways to import future water. But I want to recognize the importance of being practical, of using the resources that we have and unifying our efforts, as Michael referred to. And I guess I want my proposal for thinking of imported water as being maybe something to whisper quietly, maybe not announce so dramatically, but if in the future, the Salton Sea may have a reduction of water, what types of negotiations would take place? If we're demanding water now, would that result in less cuts in the future? Open question.
I guess I would just add that there's an ongoing process, an independent review panel being led by UC Santa Cruz and a group of experts from around the country looking at, I think it initially was 18 different import proposals, bringing in water from Pacific Ocean or from the Gulf of California. I guess they have a feasibility report that's due sometime this month, and then a final report due next month. So the state's gone through several iterations. This is the most recent and I think the most thorough. So there'll be, I think, an official document coming out from the state of or this independent review panel hired by the state of California, which will be fed into a long-range planning process being run by the state of California.
Okay, Catherine.
Ok, ok. El doctor Lo nos comenta que había una pregunta sobre los proyectos que el Estado está considerando donde involucran el agua del mar. Específicamente la persona mencionaba a UC Santa Cruz. Y cuando se refería al agua del mar, se refería al agua del mar Cortés o del Pacífico. Entonces, primero Daniel nos comenta que él piensa que es muy importante pensar o hablar de este tema como el doctor Lo, como Michael y el doctor Sinclair están comentando, que tenemos que trabajar con los recursos que ya existen y específicamente los recursos del agua que ya existen. Entonces, porque muy comúnmente miramos dos tipos de propuestas, unas que parecen hasta imposible, donde dicen que debemos de importar agua y no son prácticas y no utilizan los recursos que ya existen en la región. Y hay otras propuestas que quizás sean más factibles y que puedan ser efectivas y que podríamos trabajar en conjunto y unificar todos nuestros esfuerzos para poder realmente hacer lo que sea posible, crear un proyecto que sea posible y que existan las negociaciones necesarias para poder tener el agua en el futuro. Entonces, a lo que Michael contesta, que actualmente en UC Santa Cruz existe un grupo de expertos de todo el país que están mirando a 18 propuestas diferentes sobre cómo traer agua del Océano Pacífico, del Golfo de California. Entonces, como nos comenta que hay un reporte que se está generando este mes, entonces, para ver si es factible que esto ocurra. Y también va a haber un reporte final el próximo mes.
All right, we've gone a bit over our time, but let me end this session. Let me conclude by thanking again all of our speakers, our panelists, our welcoming speakers this morning. It's been a long day, this evening as well. And this has been a very interesting conversation. I'm really glad that we were able to get this all together. This is the fourth of our series of events. I actually hope this is the beginning of a more ongoing conversation around these topics. But again, thanks to CARB and EPA for sponsoring this series, and thanks for Catherine and the HDR team for producing these events. It's been a fantastic experience for me, and I think we've all learned quite a lot on these topics. And I hope that we will have some impact on communities living by the Salton Sea. So again, thank you to people who attended. Thanks for great questions, great discussion. And thank you again, and good evening. Have a nice evening.
Muchas gracias a todos los participantes y a nuestros panelistas por participar en esta sesión esta noche. Tuvimos una conversación muy interesante y estamos muy felices de haber tenido la oportunidad de congregarnos para discutir este tema tan importante y cerrar nuestra serie de eventos. Muchas gracias por participar y esperamos que esto nos lleve a tener más conversaciones sobre estos temas tan importantes. Muchas gracias al Consejo del Aire de California, a EPA también por patrocinar esta serie de eventos, y muchas gracias a nuestro equipo de HDR por ayudarnos a producir este evento, que ha sido una experiencia fantástica para mí y también creo que para todos, porque hemos aprendido mucho sobre todos estos temas. Entonces esperamos que esto tenga un impacto para las personas que están viviendo en el Saltón Sea. Muchas gracias y muchas gracias por todas sus preguntas. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.